Thank you, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. So we have an idea exchange, and I have the microphone. I have a number of ideas I'd like to share, and so we're going to spend the first 30 minutes or so, and I'd like to talk a little bit about disruptive innovation, share a few stories about some of the patterns, some of the concepts, so that we all have an understanding of one lens through which we can view any market. And as Scott mentioned, I spend my professional consulting career these days looking across a broad range of industries, bringing this lens, helping organizations think about how they navigate market transformations. I've done a lot of that, as Scott mentioned, in the healthcare space, and I've spent quite a lot of time thinking hard about the changing role of radiologists, cardiologists, who are facing similar pressures as they think about their place in the integrated delivery network of the future, how they play a role in supporting the clinical care team. You are not alone. Many other departments, organizations are dealing with this type of change. So what I want to do is just share a few ideas for the first half hour or so about how we think about the patterns, because we believe they can be applied across industry. And although every industry is undeniably unique, there are patterns we think that are incredibly important. There are themes that reoccur. There are ideas which, if understood, can provide a route or a starting point for new growth opportunities. So with that context, I'd like to tell a story. So this is a clipper ship from the beginning of the 19th century. And so I want you to cast your mind back a couple of hundred years and picture yourself in the northeast of the United States. So 20 miles inland from Massachusetts, you have the towns of Lowell, Framingham, and this is where, a couple of hundred years ago, you began to see the very first integrated manufacturing. So you had low-cost materials, a source of labor, and these textile mills sprung up. And so at that point, the Northeast US was the low-cost manufacturing environment, somewhat like China has been for the past number of years for the world today. But their market, where they sell these textiles, was back in the old world, in Europe, where I'm from. So the question is, how do you get these textiles from the Northeast US, where they're manufactured at low cost, over to the markets of London, Paris, where the real money was going to be spent? And that is where the clipper ship came in. So this is the Glenavon, three-masted clipper ship from the early 19th century. And if you imagine the type of person who would run this would be an owner-operator model, right? So you owned the ship, you provided services, you probably owned a fleet of these things, and you would provide services to the textile mill owners. So the question I have for you, just to kick things off, would be, if you're my customer, right? I own this clipper ship or a fleet, and what do you care about? Like, you're my customer, you have some need related to getting these goods over. How do you know if I'm doing a good job? Anyone? What does a good job look like when I provide a product like this? There's no wrong answer here.
Yeah, I want to know who your customers have been that you delivered it.
Okay, so where should it be delivered? All right, so you've got to get it there to the right person, obviously fulfillment. What else would you care about? If I was competing for your business and someone else who had another clipper ship was competing, how are you going to assess cost? So how cheaply can you get these goods over there? What else do we care about? Reliability. If I lose my goods at sea, then that's going to be a bit of an issue. Does it have to be perfect reliability, or we're probably willing to accept a little loss at sea? What else? So cost, speed, time. Okay, so related to speed, but I might want it there as fast as possible. If you've got a string of clipper ships, you've got a ton of inventory tied up somewhere over the Atlantic, and that's an expensive cost. Anything else we might care about? Capacity. Okay, so I think we've probably got all the key metrics here. What you really want is as much stuff moved as quickly as possible, as cheaply as possible. So in this market, you could define a metric, tonnage per second per dollar, or something like that, per meter perhaps as well. So some metric that captures what we call the dimensions of performance that define this market. And if you want to play in this market, if you want to have a fleet of clipper ships, you better optimize against that metric. So imagine now that I am competing for your business. and I'm asked to innovate. How do I offer better service? What can I do? What would it make sense for me to do to compete more effectively relative to my competition? This is the Gillette theory of innovation, right? 3 to 4. You've taken up your tonnage from 15 tons to more like 30 to 40. You've added in an extra mast. You're catching that wind a little bit more. So the metric by which everyone cares about has gone up. Okay, so cycles of innovation are pretty slow in this industry. Let's imagine that another 30, 40 years has passed. Now it's the daughter of the shipping magnate back in with the son of the textile mill. But they want more innovation. Okay, we have a theory of how to innovate in this market. So how do we innovate? What can we do? We've added a fourth mast. Where do we go next? Anyone? Right? We know how to innovate in this market. We have engineers who are trained for this. We have a sailmakers union who is lobbying for this. This is our bread and butter. Another 35, 40 years past. Now we have our grandkids running the business. Can you see it coming? Where do we go? This thing is almost to the point of ridiculous. This is the Thomas R. Lawrence. This is this is the middle 19th century at this point. Now this thing isn't actually full of cargo, right? That's why it looks so high up in the water. When you fill this thing with cargo, it sinks right down. It looks like a skiff just touching the water. But yes, there are 7 masts there. And this absolutely was this is the reason you went and studied marine engineering at college. This thing is so complex that they had to have a special system of sort of gears and pulleys to allow the masts to shift so that this thing could tack and jib into the wind. But do we know where this story goes? This is a story of disruptive innovation. For those of you who know what that is, what were they missing? What was the theory of what innovation needs to look like missing, and why are there few sailing ships? This is a steamship. Now, this might seem perfectly logical. However, if you were a newly minted MBA preparing your spreadsheets on paper with ink and by paraffin lamp, trying to justify the NPV of an investment in this technology, let me just give you a few stats for what this would look like. Range, about 35, 40 miles on a good day. Carrying capacity, 15 tons, of which 8 is coal. Very dirty, very messy. These things had to basically stick by the coastlines. And in fact, they were confined to the inland waterways, the Mississippi River, which is where they started to ply their trade, because there they had one key ingredient, one aspect of the technology against which sail could not compete. And what's that? Yeah, they can move upstream. They don't depend on the wind, right? So they took what was perceived as a weakness, as something that was an inferior technology, something in which no shipping magnate with their fleet of clipper ships could conceive of investing in, because it didn't serve a problem that their customers were facing. There was no immediate profitability. And yet this was able to find a market in the inland waterways of the United States. So they start here. They were able to connect up to the Great Lakes. Over time, they moved east, and they started running shipping schedules up and down the Atlantic coast. Still not venturing out to sea, but they took advantage of their reliability and the fact that they were quite safe, and they started shipping passengers up and down the coasts. And in fact, if you were in a port town, Washington, D.C., Boston, at that time, you would see by the port they started to put up signposts that provided the exact time at which the ship would come past. And what's interesting about these, the steamship model is they started to, instead of an owner-operator model, they developed an entirely new business model, because instead of carrying cargo, they were carrying people. So you typically find that there was a joint venture where they partnered with a group that was onshore that was doing the marketing and would look somewhat like a travel agency does today. So a very different model, solving for a different customer problem, but they'd found route to make this profitable. Now, of course, some bright spark entrepreneur looked at that 45-mile range and said, I wonder if I set sail or steam and head straight out across the Atlantic. And they discovered, in fact, the first thing they tried was to put a big paddle wheel on the back of a clipper ship. And that managed to get them further and further out to sea, but unfortunately putting masts and paddle wheels and taking paddle wheels out into the ocean proved to be an incredibly dangerous task, and so a number of these early experiments blew up. But they kept on innovating, and in one of the next innovations they tried was to try with screw propulsion, which is what you see in the picture up here. So they put great big propellers at the back of the ship, and that was a huge innovation, allowed them to go much faster. However, it turns out that when you bolt a huge, great propeller onto a wooden hulled ship, it creates so much shaking and vibration that all the rivets and the wood starts to come apart at the seams, which caused some of the early experiments to sink. So it required another innovation, which led us to the advent of the steel-based hull. So you can thank the early experiments in screw propulsion for the modern metal-framed ships that we see today. But this wasn't just a technical innovation, as I've said. They had this entire system, this business model that provided the marketing ability on land. They outfitted these ships for luxury because they were carrying passengers up and down, so they were able to get over the dirtiness of the smoke and the steam, and able to create quite luxurious passenger service up and down the coast. So what we have here is an emerging business model that is ripe to disrupt the market, but it hasn't done so yet. What happened next is an environmental change. So does anyone know what happened in 1849? And your clue is Ireland. Potato famine. So in 1849, the potato famine happened, and all of a sudden we had a huge number of people who have an unmet need, what in Insight language we would call they had a job to be done. And they start looking around for solutions which will satisfy that job. And the job they had was, I need to get to the United States. Because the second thing that happened 10 years later, in 1859, was that Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act. So not only did you have a driving force pushing people to want to escape Ireland, you now created a pulling force, because one of the benefits of the Homestead Act was that it would provide anybody who settled a piece of land 160 acres at no cost, so long as they farmed and improved it. You may have seen those at the Tom Cruise movie where they ride on horses and plant flags. So that was as a result of the Homestead Act. So these two opportunities in the market created an enormous pool. And if you think now about the potential customer who's sitting in Ireland or somewhere in Europe, and they are evaluating the solutions. For years and years, the no-brainer solution has been you get passage on a clipper ship. But all of a sudden, the clipper ships, it turns out, have a problem in this new market. If you actually went back to the Glen Avon and that photo and you zoomed out, you would actually see a small plaque printed on it, which says, lost at sea with all her crew in 1887. If you looked at what was happening to the Thomas R. Lawrence, our 7-masted behemoth, it would run aground or run offshore of Sicily, spilling 50,000 barrels of paraffin oil. Because sailing ships were inherently incredibly dangerous. And when you are a passenger, you care more about safety than tonnage, price, and the speed. You will pay a premium for safety. And so as you evaluate the two options that you have, going via clipper ship or going via this new technology that has emerged, all of a sudden you find there's a market tipping point. And it required a confluence of a number of things. It required the existence of an unsatisfied job to be done, an emerging technology, and an environmental or market change, which gave impetus to the job and allowed this technology, which had taken root, to flourish. And then over a period of 25 years, we saw the entire market flip. And sailing ships essentially were all bankrupt, and steam technology became the standard driver of transportation across the Atlantic. So it all comes down to those three things. The old market solved for a different customer job. That customer was the textile mill owner who cared about certain dimensions of performance. They had a very specific job to be done, and the sailing ship was a great solution. But the environment changed, regulation created a new job to be done, which was oriented around a different customer, and this time it's an immigrant. There were different dimensions of performance that mattered, i.e. safety rather than just pure speed and cost. and an emerging technology which, when embraced in the right business model, which included essentially marketing in this case, that would go direct to customer, they were able to seize upon that market disruption. So at this point, I think I'd suggest a couple of thoughts around the ways in which this might be generalizable to healthcare. So I am not a deep healthcare expert, and what I'd like to do is make sure we provided the frame, some language, some context, and then have a discussion so that we can all benefit from the experience that we have brought into the room and the expertise around, I think, these few concepts. So the first is the concept of disruptive versus sustaining innovation. In sustaining innovation, which I jokingly refer to as the Gillette model of innovation, you're adding sales, right? You do what you've always done, you make it better, faster, stronger. In disruptive innovation, you're often making things simpler, de-featured, and often you're actually offering those services to a different type of customer than you have traditionally offered. But it's a customer who you are not staring at squarely. The second thing is that that job then leads to a business model. And the business models which succeed offer a solution to that job, but they integrate the entire set of services around that business model. So often you can't just cram the model you've always had, in this case sailing ships and clipper ships, into a new model and just try to market differently. You actually require a fundamentally different technology, platform, and all the processes, services, the people that wraps around it to enable it to be delivered. Because the advantage is in fact in your business model, the way you bring that value to market. So at this point, what I'd like to do is tee up 3 questions. And then once I've shared these 3 questions, I'd like you to kind of, pull together groups of 3 to 4, maybe find a table. If you haven't met the barman yet, he's over here and happy to serve you. But grab a drink, take these 3 questions, and spend about 50 minutes wrestling with these questions as a group. And then what we'll do is we'll come back, we can do the standing, and I'd like to have a discussion about how these questions apply to the roles that you have today. So the first question, around the customer. How has your customer changed? Who has your customer been in the past? Now, I want to get more specific than just the patient or the hospital provider system. Try and think about the particular person and what their jobs to be done are. And then I want you to think about how that customer is changing. Is it a different person who you're really now selling solutions for? Is there a different, and what is the job that they are trying to get done? One example I've heard of a little bit today is a discussion around adherence. So then the question I had for the person who I had this discussion with, is adherence something that a patient wants to buy, or is that something that a pharmacist is trying to optimize against? Right? So I think it's very easy to jump quickly to answers around what this is, but I would try to tie this back to whoever you think the customer is and articulate carefully what exactly is the problem they are trying to solve in their lives, and how can we articulate that in a way that would actually mirror what a patient or a customer might say. Once we've talked about the customer and understood how they've changed, let's talk about the context. So what is it that prevents the customer from solving that job? What was it that prevented a customer in Europe buying the clipper ship solution to get to the US? What are the dimensions of performance which are just not there and which would need to be overcome by any innovation that would then unlock that market demand? And what are the catalysts that we're seeing out there? These are things that may be happening in the moment. These could be other environmental factors. Some of these have likely already happened, but there may be others on the horizon. So what are these catalysts that are enabling these barriers to be overcome? Are they technological change, regulatory change? And then finally, a question for all of you, which is what steps have you taken or might you take? And so I'd encourage you to spend 5 minutes of this conversation thinking about the steps that you could take to drive this type of innovation inside your organizations. So with that, I will pause, hand it over to you. We'll take 15 minutes, grab a drink, groups of 3 or 4, and I'd encourage you to come up with some answers to these questions, and then we will have a discussion.